Imagine standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into an abyss so dark and vast that it seems to stare back at you. But this isn't any ordinary precipice. This is the edge of your own consciousness, and what lies beneath is everything about yourself that you've spent a lifetime avoiding. Every suppressed emotion, every denied impulse, every aspect of your personality that you've banished to the shadows because it didn't fit the image you wanted to project to the world. Now imagine discovering that this dark abyss isn't just a passive void. It's been actively controlling your life from the depths, pulling invisible strings that determine who you fall in love with, what careers you choose, which friendships flourish or die, and why certain patterns repeat in your existence with clockwork precision. The person you believe yourself to be rational, self-directed, in control, is merely the tip of an iceberg, while the massive, hidden bulk beneath the surface governs the trajectory of your entire existence. This isn't metaphorical speculation. This is the terrifying reality that Carl Jung uncovered through decades of studying the human psyche. You are not who you think you are, and the life you believe you're consciously creating is largely the product of forces operating completely outside your awareness. In this video, we are going to explore one of the most powerful revelations from the Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst Carl Gustav Jung, one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century, and uncover the biggest mistake that most people make in life. This mistake is subtle, almost invisible, but it has the power to determine your destiny without you even realizing it. And by the end of this journey, I promise you will discover not only what this mistake is, but also the single most important key to freeing yourself from it. The last insight I will reveal is by far the most powerful of all, and it has the potential to completely change the way you understand yourself and the world around you. Before we begin, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel. Leave a like, comment your reflections along the way, and share this video with those you believe will benefit from it. What you are about to hear contains truths that can transform the way you see your life. Stay until the end, because the final revelation might be the missing piece you have been searching for. Carl Jung, unlike many of his contemporaries, believed that the human being is not merely a product of external circumstances, but also the result of the complex world of the unconscious. He argued that ignoring this inner world is the greatest mistake we make. We strive to control everything outside of us, our careers, our finances, our image, even our relationships, but we often neglect the inner forces that quietly shape everything we do. The roots of this monumental oversight stretch deep into the very foundations of how we understand consciousness itself. For centuries, Western philosophy and science have operated under what Jung called the fallacy of the rational mind, the dangerous assumption that human behavior springs primarily from logical, conscious decision-making processes. This belief system, inherited from the Enlightenment and reinforced by modern materialistic thinking, has created a civilization of people who are strangers to themselves. Consider the philosophical lineage that led to this predicament. René Descartes famously declared, "I think, therefore I am," establishing the thinking mind as the cornerstone of human identity. The rationalists who followed Spinoza, Leibniz, and later the empiricists like Locke and Hume all reinforced the notion that consciousness could be understood through logical analysis and sensory experience alone. But what they failed to account for was the vast territory of the psyche that operates entirely outside rational awareness. Jung discovered that this rational bias wasn't just a philosophical error, it was a psychological defense mechanism. The conscious ego, terrified of its own limitations and fragility, constructed an elaborate illusion of control to protect itself from the chaos and unpredictability of the unconscious depths. We tell ourselves we are rational beings who occasionally act irrationally, when the truth is far more disturbing. We are fundamentally irrational beings who occasionally achieve moments of clarity. This defensive mechanism operates through what Jung termed psychological inflation, the ego's tendency to identify itself with the entirety of the psyche, denying the existence of anything beyond its narrow sphere of awareness. Like a king who believes his small castle represents the entire kingdom, the conscious mind assumes it governs all psychological territory, while vast regions of the unconscious operate autonomously, following their own laws and pursuing their own agendas. The tragedy deepens when we realize that modern society actively reinforces this delusion. Our educational systems reward logical thinking and punish emotional expression. Our workplaces demand rational efficiency, while treating intuition and creativity as luxuries. Our relationships are expected to follow reasonable patterns of communication and compromise, while the deeper archetypal forces that actually govern attraction, intimacy, and commitment remain unacknowledged and unexplored. Jung traced this problem back to what he called the loss of soul in modern civilization. Ancient cultures understood that human beings were complex creatures governed by invisible forces, gods, spirits, ancestors, and archetypal energies that demanded recognition and reverence. These societies developed elaborate rituals, myths, and practices designed to maintain a conscious relationship with the unconscious realm. But the rise of scientific materialism stripped away these ancient wisdoms, declaring them primitive superstitions. We gained tremendous technological power, but we lost touch with the deeper currents of the psyche. The gods didn't disappear, they went underground, becoming autonomous complexes that now possess individuals without their knowledge or consent. The spirits became neuroses, the archetypal energies became compulsions, and the ancestral wisdom became repetitive family patterns that trapped generation after generation in the same destructive cycles. This disconnection from our psychological depths creates what existentialist philosophers like Sartre and Camus recognized as the fundamental alienation of modern existence. We become estranged from our own nature, living what Kierkegaard called lives of quiet desperation, sensing that something essential is missing, but unable to identify what it might be. The hidden problem runs even deeper than individual psychology. It's embedded in the very structure of how we organize reality. We've created a culture that demands we present ourselves as coherent, consistent, rational actors, while our actual experience is fragmented, contradictory, and largely mysterious, even to ourselves. This creates an impossible double bind. We must pretend to be something we're not, purely rational beings, while simultaneously trying to manage forces we refuse to acknowledge exist, unconscious complexes, archetypal energies, and shadow projections. The result is a civilization of people who are perpetually at war with themselves, fighting battles they cannot understand against enemies they cannot see, wondering why their carefully laid plans so often lead to outcomes they never intended. The consequences of living in denial of our unconscious depths aren't merely personal, they ripple outward through every layer of human experience, creating a cascade of dysfunction that shapes families, communities, and entire civilizations. What Jung discovered was that the unconscious doesn't simply disappear when ignored. It becomes more powerful, more autonomous, and ultimately more destructive. At the neurological level, modern brain research has validated Jung's insights in ways he could never have imagined. The limbic system, our emotional processing center, operates far faster than the prefrontal cortex, making split-second decisions that our rational mind then scrambles to justify. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio's research on patients with damage to emotional processing areas revealed that without access to unconscious emotional wisdom, people make catastrophically poor decisions, even when their logical reasoning remains intact. This neurological reality explains why pure rationality fails so spectacularly in human affairs. Your unconscious mind processes approximately 11 million bits of information per second, while your conscious awareness handles roughly 40 bits. You are literally making life-altering decisions based on 0.0004% of available information, while remaining convinced you're being perfectly logical and thorough. Consider how this manifests in relationships. When you feel inexplicably drawn to someone who's clearly wrong for you, or when you sabotage connections that could bring genuine happiness, you're witnessing the unconscious in action. Jung called this projection, the unconscious process by which we cast our unintegrated psychological material onto others, seeing them not as they are, but as carriers of our own unlived possibilities or rejected aspects. The person you're irresistibly attracted to often embodies qualities your conscious mind has disowned. Perhaps the spontaneity you've buried under layers of responsibility, or the vulnerability you've armored against with false strength. The individual who triggers your rage typically mirrors shadow aspects you refuse to acknowledge in yourself. This isn't metaphorical poetry. It's psychological mechanism operating with mechanical precision. In families, these unconscious dynamics create what Jung termed psychological inheritance, patterns of behavior, emotional reactions, and life choices that pass from generation to generation, like invisible genetic code. The workaholic father who never learned to process grief creates a daughter who becomes addicted to crisis and drama. The mother who sacrificed her creative dreams for family duty unconsciously sabotages her son's artistic ambitions. These aren't conscious choices. They're autonomous complexes, playing out their ancient scripts through new actors. At the societal level, collective unconscious forces manifest as what Jung called mass psychosis periods, when entire populations fall under the spell of archetypal energies they don't recognize or understand. The rise of authoritarian movements, mass hysteria, economic bubbles, and social media addiction all demonstrate how unconscious forces can possess groups just as readily as individuals. Consider the psychological mechanism behind scapegoating, a phenomenon that has repeated throughout history with tragic regularity. When a community refuses to face its own shadow material, its greed, violence, prejudice, and fear, it projects these qualities onto a convenient other. The Jews become carriers of financial corruption, immigrants become vessels for economic anxiety, and political opponents become repositories for all moral failings. The projection allows the group to maintain its illusion of righteousness while acting out its most destructive impulses. Modern social media has amplified these projection mechanisms to unprecedented levels. The algorithm-driven polarization we see in online discourse isn't just about opposing viewpoints, it's about shadow projection on a massive scale. People encounter ideas that threaten their ego structure and immediately project their own unconscious aggression onto the messenger, creating cycles of outrage and righteousness that feel justified but accomplish nothing except the reinforcement of existing divisions. Perhaps most tragically, living in denial of the unconscious creates what Viktor Frankl identified as an existential vacuum, a profound sense of meaninglessness that no external achievement can fill. When people lose touch with the deeper symbolic and archetypal dimensions of existence, life becomes a series of arbitrary pursuits that ultimately satisfy nothing. This explains why rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide continue rising in societies that have achieved unprecedented material prosperity. The unconscious doesn't operate according to the timeline of rational planning. It works through what Jung called synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that reveal the deeper patterns organizing your life. When you ignore these patterns, you miss crucial guidance about timing, relationships, and life direction. You end up fighting against the current of your own deeper nature, exhausting yourself in pursuits that were never meant for you, while missing opportunities that would have unfolded naturally if you had been listening to the wisdom of your unconscious depths. The price of unconsciousness isn't just personal suffering, it's the perpetuation of collective patterns that keep humanity trapped in cycles of conflict, environmental destruction, and spiritual emptiness that no amount of technological progress seems able to resolve. But here's where Jung's vision becomes revolutionary. The very forces that have been controlling your life unconsciously can become your greatest allies once you learn to work with them consciously. This isn't about conquering or eliminating the unconscious. Such attempts only strengthen its autonomous power. Instead, it's about what Jung called individuation, the courageous process of becoming who you actually are, rather than who you think you should be. The rebellion begins with a radical shift in perspective that turns everything you've been taught about personal development upside down. Instead of trying to become a better version of your current self, you must be willing to discover that your current self is largely a construction, a persona you've built to navigate social expectations, while your authentic nature remains buried in the unconscious depths. This realization is simultaneously terrifying and liberating. It means that the personality you've spent decades perfecting, the image you've carefully crafted, the strategies you've developed for success and acceptance, all of this represents what Jung called the false self, a necessary but ultimately limiting adaptation to external demands. Your real self, the one capable of genuine fulfillment and authentic relationship, has been waiting in the shadows all along. The first step in this rebellion is learning to recognize the voice of the unconscious in your daily experience. Jung discovered that the unconscious communicates through a symbolic language that bypasses rational understanding entirely. Your dreams aren't random neural static. They're nightly messages from the deeper layers of your psyche, offering guidance, warnings, and insights that your conscious mind cannot access through logical analysis. But the unconscious speaks through more than dreams. It communicates through your spontaneous reactions, your inexplicable attractions and repulsions, the mistakes you make repeatedly, and the synchronistic events that seem to orchestrate themselves around crucial life transitions. When you start paying attention to these subtle communications, you begin to realize that there's an intelligence operating in your life that's far more sophisticated than your ego could ever be. The key insight that separates Jung's approach from conventional therapy is this: your symptoms are not problems to be solved, but messages to be understood. The depression that won't lift despite medication, the anxiety that persists despite rational reassurance, the relationship patterns that repeat despite conscious awareness, these aren't failures of your conscious will. They're the unconscious mind's way of demanding that you pay attention to disowned aspects of yourself that refuse to remain buried. Consider someone struggling with chronic anger. Traditional approaches focus on anger management techniques for controlling and expressing rage appropriately. Jung's approach asks a different question. What is this anger trying to tell you about yourself? Often, chronic anger masks disowned power, unexpressed creativity, or violated boundaries that the conscious mind has been too afraid to acknowledge. The anger isn't the problem, it's the messenger pointing toward aspects of your authentic self that demand recognition and integration. This process requires what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. Instead of immediately trying to resolve psychological conflicts, you learn to sit with contradiction, allowing apparently incompatible aspects of yourself to coexist without forcing premature resolution. You might discover that you contain both profound gentleness and fierce aggression, both desperate need for connection and fierce independence, both spiritual longing and materialistic desires. Rather than choosing sides in these internal wars, individuation means learning to contain these opposites until they transform into something entirely new. The rebellion also demands that you question the fundamental assumption of modern psychology that mental health means feeling good and functioning well according to social standards. Jung recognized that sometimes psychological disturbance is a sign of health, indicating that your psyche is refusing to adapt to conditions that are fundamentally opposed to your authentic nature. The person who can't sleep because they're working in a soul-crushing job, the individual who develops anxiety in superficial relationships, the artist who becomes depressed when forced into conventional success, these might not be pathologies to be cured, but wisdom to be honored. Historical examples illuminate this path. Friedrich Nietzsche's psychological breakdown led to his most profound philosophical insights about the necessity of creating personal meaning in a meaningless universe. Vincent van Gogh's mental anguish was inseparable from his artistic genius. His suffering wasn't an obstacle to creativity, but the very source of his revolutionary vision. Jung himself experienced what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of psychological crisis that led to his most important discoveries about the nature of the human psyche. The rebellion requires practical tools that work with unconscious processes rather than against them. Jung developed techniques like active imagination, deliberately engaging with dream figures, fantasy images, and spontaneous visualizations, as if they were real autonomous beings with their own perspectives and wisdom. This isn't escapism or self-indulgence. It's a sophisticated method for establishing conscious dialogue with unconscious contents that have been running your life from behind the scenes. But now we arrive at Jung's most profound and transformative insight, the revelation that changes everything you thought you understood about human existence, relationships, and the very purpose of consciousness itself. After decades of exploring the deepest layers of the human psyche, Jung discovered that the ultimate mistake we make isn't simply ignoring the unconscious, projecting our shadows, or living without meaning. The greatest error, the one that underlies all other psychological suffering, is the refusal to embrace what he considered the most powerful force in the universe: love. This isn't the sentimental notion of love promoted by popular culture, nor the romantic fantasy that promises completion through another person. Jung's understanding of love was far more radical and transformative love as the fundamental principle that unifies opposites, integrates contradictions, and transforms psychological fragmentation into wholeness. This transformation begins with the most revolutionary act possible: learning to love your own shadow. Every aspect of yourself that you've rejected, denied, or tried to eliminate contains not just darkness, but potential. The rage you've suppressed might contain your authentic power. The selfishness you've condemned might hold your necessary boundaries. The weakness you've hidden might be your capacity for genuine vulnerability and connection. Jung discovered that the shadow isn't evil, it's unlived. It contains all the life energy you've disowned in order to maintain your acceptable persona. When you learn to embrace these rejected aspects with love rather than judgment, something miraculous happens. They transform. The shadow that was destructive when denied becomes creative when integrated. The very qualities that caused shame become sources of strength when accepted with compassion. But this is only the beginning of love's transformative power. Once you learn to love your own wholeness, light and shadow, strength and vulnerability, wisdom and foolishness, you become capable of loving others in their totality, rather than loving your projections of who you think they should be. This shift dissolves the fundamental illusion that has trapped humanity for millennia, the belief that love means finding someone who completes you. Jung realized that most of what people call love is actually psychological dependency disguised as intimacy. We fall in love with people who carry our unlived lives, our disowned potentials, our rejected aspects. We demand that they fulfill what we refuse to develop within ourselves. This creates relationships based on mutual projection rather than genuine recognition, two half people trying to create one whole person rather than two whole people choosing to share their completeness. The ultimate truth is that love is not about getting something from someone else. It's about becoming so whole within yourself that you overflow with the capacity to recognize and celebrate wholeness in others. When you no longer need others to carry your disowned psychological material, you can see them as they actually are, rather than as containers for your projections. This understanding extends far beyond personal relationships. Jung saw that humanity's collective problems, war, prejudice, environmental destruction, social inequality all stem from our inability to love what we consider other. Nations project their shadows onto enemy nations. Racial groups project their unwanted qualities onto different racial groups. Religious communities project their spiritual failures onto different religious communities. The same psychological mechanism that creates personal suffering creates collective tragedy. But here's the revelation that makes this insight so powerful. When you learn to love your own shadow, you automatically become less susceptible to collective projection. You stop needing external enemies to carry your disowned darkness. You become capable of recognizing the humanity in those who seem most different from you, because you've learned to recognize the humanity in the parts of yourself that you once found most unacceptable. Jung believed that the evolution of human consciousness depends on individuals developing this capacity for what he called universal love. Not the naive sentiment that pretends everyone is the same, but the mature recognition that everyone is struggling with the same fundamental challenge of integrating their light and shadow, their conscious and unconscious, their individual desires, and their connection to something greater than themselves. This is why Jung considered individuation not just a personal journey, but a service to humanity. Every person who becomes whole, who learns to love their own totality, who stops projecting their unlived lives onto others, contributes to the healing of the collective human psyche. The work you do on yourself isn't selfish. It's the most generous gift you can offer to a world desperately in need of conscious, integrated human beings. The final revelation is this: consciousness itself is an act of love. The willingness to face what you've been avoiding, to integrate what you've been rejecting, to embrace what you've been denying. This is love in its purest form. It's love because it requires you to say yes to reality as it is, rather than demanding that reality conform to your preferences and expectations. When you understand this, everything changes. Your symptoms become messengers deserving of attention rather than problems to be eliminated. Your difficult relationships become opportunities for recognizing your projections rather than evidence of others' failures. Your psychological pain becomes the labor pains of your authentic self being born rather than proof that something is wrong with you. Jung's ultimate message is both simple and revolutionary. The biggest mistake you can make in life is to live without love. Love for your whole self, love for others in their wholeness, and love for the mysterious process of consciousness itself. Everything else, success, pleasure, security, even happiness, are secondary to this fundamental choice. Choose love, not as a feeling that may or may not arise, but as a way of being that transforms everything it touches. This is the key Jung leaves for us. Love is not the reward for becoming whole. Love is the force that makes wholeness possible. The question that remains is not whether you can learn to love, but whether you have the courage to become love itself.